Derek Lawson wasn't a man who spooked easy. After years in naval black ops, a quiet life on the outskirts of Mesa, Arizona, was the retirement he earned in. Nobody told him what he could or couldn't do on his own land. His garage was his sanctuary. Motorcycles, framed certifications, mounted custom tools, each piece carefully arranged, like a story only veterans could read. On a late summer evening, just as the desert sun dipped below the rooftops and the cicadas began humming their usual warning, two men in matching windbreakers strolled onto his driveway. They didn't knock. They stood like they owned the place, arms folded, eyes scanning his front porch. Derek wiped grease from his hands and stepped outside. He hadn't received any warning or letter from the HOA, but the taller one spoke first, introducing himself. With a clipped tone and a name tag that was barely attached to his coat, the men claimed they were from the neighborhood's compliance division, something Derek had never heard of in the official HOA charter. According to them, his visible weapon display, locked and safely mounted in his own garage, posed a community intimidation threat. They pointed to a clipboard filled with generic printouts and citations that didn't match any known HOA section numbers. When Derek asked for a copy of the HOA charter they were referencing, they deflected with vague threats. The shorter one leaned slightly toward the garage door, squinting past Derek to get a better look at the wall. Derek followed his gaze, but didn't move. His instincts kicked in. Something was wrong. These men weren't real officers. They weren't even good at pretending. The short one finally said it. They were authorized to remove hostile displays from member properties. Without court involvement, it wasn't a request, it was a demand. Derek didn't answer. He just slowly pulled up his left sleeve, revealing a forearm covered in ink dark lines, weaving together symbols not everyone would recognize, but the men did. And their body language changed the moment they saw it. One of them shifted uncomfortably, as if rethinking everything. Derek didn't blink. The taller man glanced at the tattoo, then looked away too quickly. They were starting to realize they weren't dealing with a homeowner who panics. They were dealing with someone trained to measure every breath, every movement, every word. He stepped forward. Slow but direct. You've got 30 seconds to leave. You don't want to find out what happens if you use even one more second. The taller one muttered something about calling their supervisor. The shorter one stepped back toward the curb. Neither of them said another word. They got in their car and drove off. No plate frames, no markings, just dust and brake lights. Derek watched from his driveway until they turned the corner. Then he walked back into the garage, turned the camera feed back on, and opened the bottom drawer of his metal toolbox. Inside was a file with old numbers and names. People he hadn't contacted in years. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He took a breath, pulled out his phone, and tapped one number labeled simply, Ramirez neighbor. Derek's voice was calm but pointed. You free to talk? On the other end, Officer Ramirez picked up right away. And just like that, a quiet suburban standoff turned into something much bigger. Derek had dealt with liars before. Overseas, he'd faced double agents and locals who switched sides with the wind. But there was something different about seeing that same kind of fraud show up in your driveway, wearing a cheap badge and waving hollow authority. Officer Ramirez lived just a few doors down. They'd grilled steaks together. Their kids had gone to the same school. Ramirez wasn't just law enforcement, he was a friend. And more importantly, a straight shooter. When Derek explained what happened, Ramirez went quiet for a moment. Those badge numbers sound fake, he finally said. And there's no such thing as an HOA compliance division with those powers, not in this neighborhood, not in this county. Derek sent over the doorbell camera footage, zoomed in on the ID tags, and included a still shot of their Karan old tan sedan with a dent in the rear passenger door. Ramirez said he'd run the plates first thing in the morning, but he didn't like what he was hearing. They knew what to say, Derek replied. They had just enough legal-sounding words to get someone nervous. Someone less prepared would have let them in. You think they're gonna come back? Derek didn't answer right away. He was staring at the same footage, rewinding it over and over, focusing on how casually they tried to step toward the garage. They weren't worried about being challenged. They were confident, too confident. I think they weren't done. I think they were testing. Later that night, Derek went through his old gear, the leftover tools from years ago, most of which hadn't seen daylight since retirement. He unpacked a box labeled Observation Kit. Inside were motion sensors, thermal strips, a silent alarm trigger, and a micro-drone no larger than a coffee cup. He installed the motion sensor along the walkway. He rewired the porch light to flicker in Morse code if someone crossed the line. It blinked once during testing. Once again when he stepped back to admire the setup. Then he closed the garage. But not all the way. Just enough to let someone think. He forgot that was the bait. That next morning, Derek drove to the HOA office in person. The manager, a polite woman named Holly, confirmed what Ramirez had suspected. There was no compliance division beyond the basic HOA board, no armed field agents, and certainly no late-night visits were authorized. She looked uncomfortable, the more Derek described. When he showed her the footage, her face turned pale. Those men aren't on any of our rosters, she said, and we never file weapon violations. That's not even something we regulate. Holly agreed to issue a warning to the entire neighborhood, but Derek had a feeling that wouldn't stop them. These men weren't looking for HOA authority. They were using the title as a disguise. By the time Derek returned home, Ramirez had already left a message, ran the plate, came back invalid. Not stolen, just fake, like printed and slapped on. DMV has no record. Derek replayed the moment one of the men stared at his tattoos. That's when things had shifted. They saw something familiar, or maybe something that triggered a memory they didn't want to relive. He rolled down his sleeve again and stared at the ink. To most it looked like artwork, but to men in certain circles, it was a signal of training, of background, of capability. It told a story no badge could match. That evening, as the sun sank behind the roofs again, Derek sat on the tailgate of his truck and cleaned a wrench with an old rag. It wasn't for show. It was habit, routine, focus. Across the street, a car slowly crept past. Different color, different model, but the same rhythm of hesitation. It stopped 2 houses down, paused for just a second too long, and then rolled off. They were watching, and now, he was watching back. Derek had built his fence himself, tall, reinforced, and lined with subtle sensors embedded in the slats. To most, it looked like an ordinary privacy barrier, but to him, it was a controlled perimeter. 2 days had passed since the fake officers first appeared, and the neighborhood buzz had already started. One neighbor asked Derek about the new patrolman. Another mentioned seeing the tan sedan twice in one morning. Derek didn't respond. He simply thanked them and walked inside, locking his door with a flick of muscle memory. That night, the motion sensor blinked twice, not from the driveway, from the side gate. Derek moved without sound, slipping into the garage, where the feed played silently on his mounted tablet. A figure crouched low, just inside the yard, wearing gloves. Hoodie pulled tight, no flashlight. He triggered the silent alarm. 30 seconds later, another blip appeared, this time behind the shed. A second person. They were probing the perimeter, not to break in, but to measure reaction time. Derek didn't give them one. He stayed still. He let them crawl and stumble around the side of his house for 5 full minutes. Then he tapped a button. The sprinkler system erupted not with water, but with biodegradable blue dye. Both men leaped backward, soaked in streaks that marked them like criminals fleeing a bank job. He didn't chase them, he just filmed. By the time they hit the sidewalk and tore down the street, Derek already had their faces captured. Masks slipped during the scramble, eyes wide from the surprise. In the morning he uploaded the footage to a secure cloud and sent copies to Ramirez. But he didn't stop there. He had contacts people who owed him favors. Within hours, he had 2 names, Marcus Shaw and Brandon Kelm. Both had records. Both had a history of impersonating officials in other states. What made it worse was what they were now suspected of, not just fake citations, but targeting veterans, specifically ones known to own firearms. They were part of a ring that posed as HOA agents, gained access under the pretense of safety enforcement, and stole weapons to sell on black market networks. A handful of homes across state lines had already been hit. Derek wasn't just a target. He was a profile match. And he had every intention of flipping the script. He called Jackson next. Jackson wasn't law enforcement anymore, but he used to be Federal Fugitive Recovery. These days he ran a private security consulting firm, but he never turned down a chance to help a fellow vet, especially when there was bad blood involved. You got eyes on them? Jackson asked. They'll be back, Derek replied. They're too desperate not to. Then we'll be ready. That night, they didn't sleep. Jackson parked down the street with a long lens and thermal scope. Derek stayed inside, seemingly unaware, porch light dimmed, garage door slightly ajar. At 2:14 a.m., the sidewalk shadows shifted again. The same car from before rolled slowly past, then turned around, parked 1 house down. 2 doors clicked. Same 2 figures stepped out. No clipboards this time, just backpacks. They moved fast, silent, sticking to the edge of the lawn. Derek stayed behind the curtain, watching the feed, unmoving. The first one reached the porch, the second moved toward the garage. Then Derek tapped a button. A high-frequency alarm pierced the silence, inaudible to neighbors, but clear enough. 2 disorient strobes kicked out around the house, not bright, but flickering enough to destroy night vision. The men froze. Derek opened the front door slowly, just enough for them to hear him speak. You've got one chance to sit on that lawn and keep your hands visible. Otherwise, the man down the street isn't going to wait for the badge. They didn't move, but someone else did. Jackson walked up from behind, slow and calm. One of the men turned just in time to feel the weight of a knee press him to the grass. The other dropped his bag. Inside it were 6 lockpicks, a zip tie bundle, and a blank HOA notice template. Derek stood over them, arms crossed. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just said, "Now we find out how many houses you've hit before you landed at mine." The house was quiet again by sunrise, but it wasn't the kind of peace that brings comfort. It was the stillness that follows when things begin unraveling behind the scenes. Jackson had cuffed both men with reinforced zip ties and kept them seated until Ramirez arrived. The officer didn't come alone. He brought backup. Quiet, Unmarked, efficient. No sirens, no shouting. Just cold questions and the kind of looks you only give when things stop adding up. Derek stood by while the two were separated. Marcus Shaw tried to deny everything, claimed it was a misunderstanding, said they thought Derek was someone else, that they had the wrong address. Brandon Kelm didn't speak much at all, but he didn't have to. He reeked of nervous sweat, and his silence was louder than any excuse. Ramirez stepped aside with Derek. Once the scene was secure, "This goes beyond impersonating," he said. "Their car was wiped clean, no plates, no ID inside, and the bag we found in the trunk. Blueprints, maps, neighborhood layouts from 3 different counties. This wasn't their first attempt." Derek asked the question no one else had. "What about the buyers?" Ramirez paused. "That's what worries me. The 2 suspects were taken into custody, but that didn't mean it was over. If anything, it raised more questions than it answered. The fake citations, the missing weapons, and other states, the pattern of targeting homeowners with military backgrounds. Someone was feeding them addresses. Someone who knew who had what and where it was kept." Back inside, Derek cleaned up the porch, quietly reinstalling the pressure sensor beneath the welcome mat and covering the wiring along the eaves. He didn't like open ends. And this had too many. Later that evening, while checking the drone's footage one last time, he spotted something strange. It wasn't from the night of the capture, it was earlier. From the day before, a third figure, across the street, not in the car. Someone on foot. Watching, he paused the clip, zoomed in. The figure was wearing a delivery vest, one of those standard courier outfits. But he never walked up to any door, never rang a bell, just paced in slow circles on the sidewalk, staring too long at each house. At his house. Derek sent the clip to Jackson with a single message: "Third man." 5 minutes later, Jackson called back. "You just stepped into something organized. That's not a porch pirate, that's surveillance. Someone sent those 2 to make contact, but someone else was pulling the strings." Derek looked out the window. The street was still. Neighbors watered their lawns. Kids chalked drawings on driveways. But now, even the quiet had edges. The HOA board called him that night. They'd heard rumors. The board president asked Derek to attend an upcoming emergency session to explain what happened and what the rest of the neighborhood needed to know. Derek didn't hesitate. When the meeting came, he stood at the front of the room, hoodie sleeves pulled up, tattoos visible, and the footage playing behind him. No dramatics. No me pointing, just facts, footage, and quiet authority. "This wasn't just about me," he told the room. "It was about all of you. These guys wore the right clothes, said the right words, and pretended they had power. But it was fake, and it almost worked." One resident asked what they could do if someone showed up pretending. Again, Derek didn't tell them to fight. He told them to prepare, to question, to verify. To verify. As he stepped away from the podium, he paused near the door. "Anyone can wear a badge," he said, "but it's what you've lived through that tells people who they're really dealing with." That night, while the rest of the neighborhood returned to normal, Derek didn't go to bed. He stayed up, piecing together faces and patterns. There was still a third man, still someone out there watching, and he wasn't finished. Days passed, but Derek's sense of alert never faded. If anything, it sharpened. Something was off, not just about the 2 men now in custody, but about the missing piece in the puzzle. The third man, the one who hadn't spoken, hadn't knocked, hadn't touched anything. The one who only watched. It wasn't just a gut feeling anymore. It was personal. Derek reviewed the footage again, this time framed by the supposed delivery man had walked a perfectly measured path 10 feet between each stop. Always the same duration, standing in front of each house. He paused a full 22 seconds longer at Derek's home. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. He clipped the image from the drone feed and enhanced it. Clean shave. No delivery in hand. Radio in his vest pocket. He wasn't delivering anything. He was collecting. Jackson confirmed it by nightfall. "He's not a local." Ran the face through a few private databases. "No hits, but I've got a guy who thinks he's seen him before. Not with HOA scams. With contractor fraud rings." Derek leaned back in his chair. That was the missing piece. The scam wasn't just about stealing weapons. It was about intel, collecting property info, layouts, response times, target habits. They were building a map of vulnerabilities, and they weren't doing it alone. That night, Derek changed his routine. Lights off earlier, no porch light, but the garage left open just a crack, same as before. The trap was reset, only this time, he added something new, a second drone, quieter, faster, programmed to follow heat signatures, not motion. It hovered above the house from midnight to 3, feeding a thermal overlay directly to Derek's monitor. At 2:16 a.m., the screen blinked. A figure walking at the edge of the sidewalk. Same height, same build, same slow pace. But this time, he didn't linger. He turned at the corner and disappeared, until the camera feed on Derek's back fence caught him slipping through the neighbor's side yard. The third man had changed tactics. Derek didn't hesitate. He slipped on his boots, tapped twice on the transmitter to alert Jackson, and moved through the side entrance of the garage. He stayed low, stepping only on the dirt to avoid triggering his own sensors. Behind the neighbor's shed, he caught a flash of movement. The man wasn't expecting him. Derek stepped forward with a calm voice. Wrong yard? Wrong house? Wrong neighborhood. The man spun, startled, but didn't run. His posture was controlled, confident. He smiled. You're quicker than the others, he said. But that's why we came for you first. It was a confession and a challenge. He didn't have a weapon visible, but Derek wasn't going to wait for one to appear. He stepped closer, tension coiled in his stance. But before he could close the distance, a car engine roared from the street, and headlights flashed. Briefly, the man backed away into the dark and vanished over the fence. By the time Derek reached the street, only tire tracks remained. He didn't chase. He didn't need to. The drone had caught everything. Jackson pulled up 10 minutes later, glanced at the footage, and nodded. That's the one. He's not just Marcel, he's the scout. This isn't a scam anymore. This is coordinated targeting, and someone up the chain is keeping it all quiet. The next morning, Derek met with Ramirez again. The footage, now including thermal signatures and audio, was enough to open an interstate investigation. This wasn't local anymore. Agencies were being looped in. But even with law enforcement now involved, Derek didn't feel finished. He knew how these groups operated. Cut one head off, another one grows. He looked out across his street, the place where kids rode bikes and sprinklers ticked on at dawn, and didn't see peace. He saw a war waiting to resurface. The street looked ordinary again. Driveways full, lawns trimmed, flags fluttering lightly in the breeze. But the peace was only surface deep. Derek knew the danger hadn't passed. It had just gone quieter. The third man had a face now. Not a name, not a traceable address. Just a face. A line he'd spoken like a warning. That's why we came for you first. Derek wasn't new to threats, but the precision behind this one meant there was coordination. Someone had been watching his movements, reading his HOA records, tracking his security layout. And not just his. Ramirez confirmed that to other homeowners, both former military, had experienced unusual visits across the state line. Their houses hadn't been broken into, nothing stolen. Just long drives, unannounced visitors, and strange paperwork left behind. Same handwriting, same fake badge numbers. A pattern was forming, and someone was testing their limits. Jackson made calls through his private network. What came back was a map and neighborhoods across 4 counties, all with minor incidents that never escalated. Until now. They called it compliance pressure, an operation that relied on people surrendering through confusion and fear rather than force. It was never about the HOA. That was just the costume. Derek met Jackson and Ramirez that evening in a local diner 2 towns over, away from cameras, away from watchful eyes. Jackson laid out the profiles of the 3 suspects confirmed so far. Low-level grifters, mostly clean records, good at blending in but not professional enough to act alone. They're not the brains, Jackson said. They're the bait. Someone's pushing them to test security patterns, and when they find a gap, they sell the location. Derek didn't need to ask who the buyers were. It was obvious. Groups that didn't want to steal a flat screen, they wanted unregistered hardware, tactical gear, military-grade equipment, and some homeowners still had it. The third man's actions made sense now. His silence, his precision, the scouting. He was the vetter, the one who filtered which homes were too dangerous to try, and which ones were worth the risk. Derek's house had landed on that list and he'd just failed their test. Back home, he began making calls of his own. Old contacts from his seat, days not to retaliate, but to notify. One of them, Marcus Edge Elway, still worked quietly for a private cybersecurity firm that monitored high-value individuals. Within hours, Edge traced a digital thread from Derek's HOA records. Someone had requested a background report using a spoofed contractor ID just 2 weeks before the incident. It hadn't come from within the HOA. It had come from a real estate brokerage firm 3 counties over, one that didn't seem to sell houses anymore, but still maintained dozens of data access licenses. The rabbit hole deepened. That night, Derek adjusted the lighting on the street-facing side of his property. Subtle flickers and a rhythmic pattern, silence signaled to Jackson and Ramirez that a response team should stay on call. He placed a decoy lockbox outside his garage. Inside wasn't a weapon, but a GPS-tracked decoy case. If someone tried to move it, they'd light up 3 databases in less than 10 seconds, and then he waited again. It wasn't long. At 3:03 a.m., the drone pinged movement, not from the usual sidewalk route. This time, from the alley behind the fence. A different approach, more careful, more methodical. A figure appeared on the rear camera, who'd pulled low gloves on. He wasn't checking windows. He was holding a phone and scanning the side of the house with the flashlight turned to red mode, low visibility, infrared dot. He was mapping the layout. Derek tapped into the drone mic. His voice came through calm and low. Wrong house. Again. The figure froze. The red light cut off. The phone dropped. And just before he could turn to run, the backyard floodlight exploded on, revealing his face clearly for the first time. It wasn't one of the original men, that it was someone new. But Derek recognized the patch. On his jacket, barely visible through the dirt and dust, a security contractor logo from overseas. One that didn't exist on paper anymore. And just like that, it wasn't just about weapons, it was about who Derek used to be. The man on the camera wasn't sloppy like the others. His face gave away nothing calm, detached, a technician, not a thug. The patch on his sleeve was nearly faded, but Derek knew the insignia by instinct. It belonged to a disbanded unit that used to handle high-risk asset retrieval in conflict zones. Privet, deniable, always off-record, that insignia wasn't supposed to be in this country. Certainly not in a suburban Arizona neighborhood under cover of HOA deception. By the time Ramirez arrived, the man had already vanished. But he'd left behind two things: the phone he dropped during the scan, and a small tool embedded into Derek's exterior panel, a fiber optic camera probe, aimed at the garage wall. They hadn't been after the home's interior. They were after the armory blueprint. Jackson arrived not long after, carrying a secure laptop and a portable signal scanner. They dissected the phone on screen. It wasn't connected to a number, only an internal command network. The last outgoing data ping had been transmitted 20 minutes before the intrusion, meaning someone had already received the mapping info. Derek stared at the screen. The layout of his own house mirrored back at him in infrared. They weren't testing, he said. They were cataloging. That confirmed it. This wasn't a scam anymore. It wasn't just opportunists. Someone was building an operational target list based on specialized hardware and former training records. And someone believed Derek Lawson's house had something they needed, or something they feared. Jackson handed over an encrypted thumb Dr. drive containing the footage to a contact at DHS. This wasn't about fake HOA citations now. This was a pattern of escalating domestic reconnaissance. And Derek's ink, his past, his reputation, they weren't deterrents. They were bait. That afternoon, the HOA board convened. Word had spread. Some residents were panicking. Others were skeptical. The board president asked Derek to speak again, this time not as a neighbor, but as someone who had clearly become the center of something larger. He didn't use scare tactics. He laid it out clearly. A pattern of impersonation, surveillance, and pressure that preyed on routine. Unlocked sheds, fences left open, blind trust in anyone with a badge. They're counting on you to be polite, he said. They're counting on you to obey before you verify. And when that fails, they disappear like smoke. Several in the room had stories they hadn't reported. A van parked too long. A doorbell camera mysteriously reset. Mail arriving with HOA letterhead but no signatures. The deception had spread farther than anyone realized. Derek proposed a simple solution. A neighborhood verification protocol. Each resident would have an ID code. Only the real board members would know. No more surprise visits. No more random citations. If someone couldn't provide the code, the door stayed closed. That night, Derek adjusted his own defenses again, this time, integrating all neighborhood cameras into one mesh network. Each sensor now triggered a chain response, alerting Jackson, Ramirez, and two other trusted neighbors. They didn't sleep, not because they were afraid, but because they understood what was coming. At 4:02 a.m., it did. A van unmarked rolled through the cul-de-sac with its lights off. The garage camera captured 4 silhouettes exiting to flanking the yard, one walking the path to the porch, and another at the back fence. But they weren't ready for what waited. The porch tile lit red. Heat sensors activated silent strobes. A sonic pulse triggered from beneath the flower bed, not painful, but disorienting. By the time the front figure reached the door, Derek opened it calmly. "I warned the last group," he said. "But you're not them, are you?" The man didn't speak. He turned to run. The yard lights ignited. 2 of Derek's neighbors stepped outside, firm, armed with flashlights and recording gear. No weapons drawn, just evidence. Perfectly timed. Jackson blocked the van's exit at the mouth of the cul-de-sac with his truck. Ramirez pulled up seconds later. There were no chase scenes, no shouting, just quiet retreat, silent footage, and 4 faces captured in full clarity. Only one of them had a familiar mark on his arm, the same faded patch. Derek knew the look. These weren't rookies. These were ex-contractors who had never stopped serving a purpose. They'd just changed who they served, and someone in a dark office, far from that quiet street, had just received word that Operation Lawson had failed. The sun rose like nothing had happened. A gentle breeze, birdsong in the trees, sprinklers sweeping in rhythm across trimmed lawns. But for the people on Derek Lawson Street, the silence felt different now. No longer peaceful, but alert. By mid-morning, the neighborhood was already buzzing. Ramirez had coordinated with federal contacts who arrived quietly. No sirens, no uniforms, just marked precision. The van's passengers were taken without resistance. Their backgrounds raised more alarms than answers. Dishonorably discharged contractors, digital forgers, men with deep access to property, data, and old military profiles. One of them had a notebook in his bag. Inside, handwritten entries. Notes about homes in 4 states. Highlighted names, deployment histories, and family schedules. Most of it was coded, but Derek's name wasn't. It was underlined. Twice they hadn't just chosen him randomly. He'd been flagged. Years ago, maybe, not for his weapons, but for something else. Maybe something he'd stopped doing, or maybe something he'd refused to do. Derek handed the notebook to the federal team. and quietly stepped out of the way. He had no interest in interviews. He'd done what he needed to defend his home, protect his neighbors, and expose the ones hiding in plain sight. Later that day, as the board met for a final post-incident review, they passed a unanimous vote to dissolve the compliance enforcement clause in their charter. No more random checks, no more surprise inspections. Everything from now on would go through official, verified channels. Derek didn't show up to that meeting. He was in his garage, polishing the side of a chrome gas tank. The radio played low. The garage door was half open, letting in enough light to reveal the clean rows of tools and the faint outline of a new tattoo wrapping around his wrist. It wasn't decorative, it was a record. A single line of ink, subtle but unmistakable. A trident split down the center, with 8 stars arcing above it, one for each attempt, one for each visitor. His phone buzzed once. A text from Jackson. They're calling it part of a broader investigation now. Multi-state, we were just the trigger. Derek didn't reply. He didn't need to. He stepped outside and walked the block slowly. People waved from porches. A teenager on a scooter gave him a respectful nod. The neighborhood felt different, not because of fear, but because now they understood who they were living next to. And maybe that's all Derek ever wanted. Not recognition, just readiness. By sundown, the street had settled. Ramirez dropped by with an unmarked envelope. Inside, a copy of the contractor unit's official declassification notice from years ago. It confirmed what Derek already suspected. Those men weren't just out of work, they'd been repurposed by a network that didn't answer to any government anymore. That same network had gone dark after the arrests, but a message still came through. A blank postcard, slipped into Derek's mailbox at dawn. On the back, one line. You weren't the target, you were the test. He held the card in his hand for a long moment, then he burned it in a coffee can beside the driveway. Later that week, a new family moved into the house across the street. Nice people, quiet. The father wore a military cap, though Derek didn't ask which branch. The man simply nodded and said, "Heard, this is a good place to raise a family." That true? Derek smiled. Depends who's asking. That night, as the garage light flicked off and the stars returned above the desert sky, Derek placed the final footage on a locked Dropkick. He stored it beside a weathered photo of his old team and a folded American flag. Then he locked the cabinet, turned out the light, and walked into the quiet. Not because he thought it was over, but because he was ready for it to begin again.